Hi, and welcome to another episode of Rule of Carnage. This is where myself, Glenn Ford, have chats and conversations and such like with this guy, Mike Hutchinson.
Hello.
The sorts of chats that we have are about designing better miniatures games. So one of the miniatures games we've been knocking around and fertling about and working on at the moment is Hobgoblin, which has just entered. It's official onto its beta test release.
Yeah, no, by the time this video hits the stores, presumably it will have been an open beta for about a month. And so you can visit the link below to check out the Hobgoblin open beta and join us on Facebook or in Discord, or you can just write to me through the post. Yeah, it's kind of exciting because this is the bit of any games development where a lot of time that's been spent iterating the rules and doing it in small groups suddenly has to impact a larger group of people who tear your thing to pieces and go, why is there hobgoblins in it? Why is it even a fantasy setting? I don't even like armies. And you're like, are these comments relevant to me or not?
Some of them are and some of them aren't. But so for the rare person who watches our channel and isn't aware, Hobgoblin is a rank and file or rank and flank fantasy mass combat game. And so we've been kicking around some ideas that relate to that sort of game, relate to some other games, some of these ideas, but we're going to have a little chat about some thoughts and realizations that possibly have come to in relation to some of those sections. So today,
but I promise we'll also mention skirmish games as well during the proceedings.
Yes, yeah, we'll try to relate these to the wider world of tabletop miniatures gaming. So today we're going to have a bit of a chat about charging and various concepts relating to the idea of moving rapidly into a state of close combat engagement, or whatever you want.
What a beautifully scientific way of describing.
So there's a few things that we want to talk about, or I want to talk about. So one of the things I think that's really interesting about Hobgoblin is that you don't need to charge in order to enter into combat. You move forwards until you bonk into something, and then you're in combat with that something. And if you move a certain distance prior to the bonkage occurring, you get a charge strength that triggers off various other things and gives you certain advantages. But you don't need to go, okay, I'm declaring a charge on this thing and I'm doing a special charge move, and I cannot enter into a certain proximity to you until I do a charge move. And that sort of charging is a slightly separate and odd thing, I think, sometimes in minis games. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that go with that. So the way that you've sort of called it out there, I suppose, is like in games with square blocks of units marching into each other, there is a pattern that quite often you have to do a charge, or you have to declare a charge. But there's an intentional moment of like, those guys, rah! Whereas of course in skirmish games and vehicle games, like that sort of intentionality and pre-declaration doesn't tend to turn up. People will attempt to cross each other's engagement zones and accidentally end up in combat, or they'll move into combat surreptitiously, or sometimes they will charge and there'll be a meaningful rule around charging. But I think it is totally worth unpacking and super interesting. And I think at the same time, a lot of even skirmish games, even sort of single miniature skirmish games, have like special qualities around charges. Like it's extremely common to say, okay, it'll cost you like all of your activation points or whatever your activation is in order to charge, and it has to be done in a straight line, and you get this preset amount of movement to it. So you have to like pre-position yourself on the turn before in order to be able to do the charge, because this straight line, and if the other guy like sidesteps slightly out, and so your engagement range will have to, because of a wall or something, not quite reach them. So we do tend to box out charging as something special with its own set of like conditions and abilities and things.
I think the reason for that, and
maybe this will lead me to realize something that I'm missing in terms of chewiness in Hobgoblin. But I think the reason for that is that one of the interesting things about like the miniatures, the physicality of the miniatures and their position on the table is that quite often charges will give you a benefit for establishing a physical relationship between two objects where there is a line and they can reach it. And the reward tends to be a little bit more movement, or movement plus attacking, when you normally would have only got the double movement if you ran and then you couldn't shoot or attack. But in this case, if you both run and end up in the person, and that, like, the placing of rules around the charge, such as you can only move in a straight line, you can't go around a corner, that might be a rule you add, or you can only charge something you can see, that might be a rule you add. All of those are rewarding, cunning, spatial relationship manipulation on the part of the player, and then asking the other player, can you see what the other guy is trying to do, and manipulate your spatial position in an interesting way to avoid the opposition from getting that additional buff or that bonus.
Yeah, so one of the ideas is sort of mentioned there is the concept of like charge advantage, and this is something we've talked about before, that a lot of games, if you complete a charge, you get some sort of additional bonus that you wouldn't have gotten if you'd received the charge, or you won't get in like the second or third round of combat. You'll get an extra attack, or your attack will hit a little bit harder, or you'll get an extra bit of movement. And, you know, we've spoken a little bit about charge advantage, and I'm not convinced of the concept of charge advantage as an assumed thing. And, you know, people have responded, and I've heard the idea a few times, that the reason that you have charge advantage in a game is to stop people from like turtling up, to stop people from, like, just sitting on their battle line and waiting for people to come to them. And I absolutely don't think that charge advantage does that, and I absolutely don't think it's for that. I don't think it does that for the big reason that, you know, is that very rarely do I worry, you know, the thing I most worry about when I'm moving is entering into your charge range if you have a powerful charge advantage. The reason I'm most likely to sit back in any given game is that if I stray into your charge range and you've got a massive charge advantage, you'll absolutely hammer the hell out of me. And so I don't think charge advantage discourages turtling. I think it encourages it an enormous amount of the time. And what you often see with like big charge advantage games, you know, is the person who's a close combat army has to walk up to like an inch in front of the other person's face.
Right. And so in your mind, it's like each element on the table is going to have some kind of threat projection. And the more extreme their threat projection is, like, the less you want to get near to them. And so the stronger you make the charge advantage, the like more dangerous that threat, that projected threat area is.
Yeah, and I also think that, I mean, you try and stop wargamers from rushing at each other, you know, screaming like lunatics with hammers. You know, it is the default position is I want to run up and pull your head off.
There's a reason we play these games.
And B, you know, what stops turtling is being the guy with one fewer gun. That stops people turtling. As soon as you realize the other person has slightly more or slightly better shooting, you are not sitting still. And there's always, unless you've got two sides with exactly equal, or that believe they have exactly equal shooting, then you're not going to get turtling. And, you know, if it's one person rushing the guns, that's fine. That's an interesting asymmetrical game. You don't need to convince the guy with the guns that he suddenly needs to jump out of his trench and run at the, you know, lunatics with the axes. So I'm not convinced by charge advantage as combating the idea of somebody turtling up. I think if they're going to turtle up, they're going to do it even with charge advantage. What I do think it is interesting in, and is useful for, is exactly what you're saying there, is that it's about encouraging and rewarding interesting tactical choices and moments. And that's part of, and I agree, I think it's part of the reason why it's tempting to box out charging and give it a set of extra little conditions, and or you can charge if you do this but not that, and when this is true and when that's not true, to give you a little like mini puzzle. And I don't think it's simulationist, and I just think it's like, here's an extra puzzle that's fun to engage with. Here are some extra levers that are fun.
Yeah, you've got whatever
the
the movement or the activation or the initiative system is to play with in terms of getting one over on the physical position of the pieces that are threatening your opponents. Is there other things that you can give them? And obviously there's plenty of other things you can give them. You can give them special abilities to jump, or you can give them ways of group activating in a surprising way, or, you know, any number of other ways to take what is the default way of moving your pieces into each other's threat ranges and say, but sometimes you get an extra little exciting tactical option. And I think charges definitely do that, whether or not you put some kind of restrictions on, you know, like when they can occur, or well, whether or not you put some restrictions on, like whether or not they're pre-declared. I think as long as you put some restrictions around, here is a scenario, here is a rules situation you can create by getting closer to them or having line of sight. Like there has to be a fun condition that you have to play for, and then you get an advantage. But I mean, that's sort of describing all of the purpose of making these rules, is to create situations you can play for and then get an advantage.
Yeah, but I think, you know, I think charging is one of those. I think one of the things about the set of conversations we're going to have now is a certain amount of this is about tropes and expectations and fulfilling gamers' expectations. And one of the reasons we hang so many of the buttons and levers of a game around charging is that's what a lot of people are expecting. You're expecting to come to the game and that charging is going to be a thing that you're going to be asked like engage with. And so when it has these little mini puzzles and these little extra bonuses for you engaging with it properly, you're like, well, yeah, this is what I bought my ticket for. This is
right. And I think, you know, in war games, to sort of head in the other direction a little bit, it's like, well, there is a really cinematic thing where, like, you know, if one guy has an axe and is going to charge into a warehouse and beat the cack out of another guy, like that's an exciting cinematic moment, and you feel like you want to see their face, you know, shouting out, and, you know, the violence is about to occur, and that's an exciting melee, like skirmish charge. Or, you know, you're watching Braveheart, and there's, you know, people thundering down the hill in this great, you know, hairy mass, and like the theater of it is exciting to wargamers, regardless of the reality of how, you know, how much running you might do in a medieval battle. But
I was thinking one of the things about like the cinematography of charges and things is that it's always, well, yeah, but it's always entirely dependent on which side of the charge the hero seems to be stood on. It's like when Aragorn is charging at somebody, charging is very dramatic and exciting. When Aragorn is standing there receiving the charge, standing there and receiving the charge is incredibly noble and awesome. And oh my God, look at his might! And I don't think that orc's got a single hope in hell. Oh yeah, there you go. Aragorn took his head right off as soon as he reached sword range. And a certain amount of these things are to do with arguments of cinematography and simulationism, depending on whether at the horror historical end or the more sort of fantasy end, possibly. But I think in actuality, you know, a lot of those arguments can be seen in almost any way, given like a certain perspective and a certain player and a certain place. And what doesn't necessarily change is the mechanical gameplay rewards and the payout of expectations, and, you know, making the game work in a more sort of clicky clacky way.
But also what is difficult to change, although not impossible, is also what the players bring to the table in terms of their expectations, and the fact that, you know, as I was building Hobgoblin, like the movement system was very simple initially, and it didn't have a charge mechanic of any kind, and that was one of the first things that people pointed out. It was like, well, can I charge units into units? And I was like, well, no, like, why would you want to do that? Like, they move into combat, like, yeah. So what, the person who gets the first, like, who rolls the initiative and gets to move their unit first, like two simultaneously moving units, one of them gets an arbitrary charge advantage because I rolled a 6 on the initiative and you rolled a 4. Like, I don't understand what you're saying. And I'm still wrestling with that problem, because, you know, at its heart, like, I very much came from a solve everything as a simultaneous battle game in Gaslands, but tropes exist and preconceptions and charge rules in other games, and it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah, so if your game is split into rounds, as most games are going to be, and each round consists of a couple of turns, and one player goes first on turn 2, and turn 2 is the turn round two, and round 2 is the round during which the two sides are within charge range of each other.
Yeah,
that means that the player who happens to be going first on round 2 gets to do charging when everything that happens on round 2 is meant to be happening simultaneously. Everybody's meant to be moving towards each other. It's not meant to be dup, 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 dup in a game. It's meant to be dup, 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 you know. So why is this guy happen to get a bonus because he happened to roll the right initiative dice, and whereas this guy doesn't, when they're both
right. And then of course the obvious answer is, well, you chose the wrong activation system. Like, just have an alternating activation system, and that might not be the right answer for a game. You know, there's many reasons why it might be the right answer or the wrong answer, but the point remains, like, regardless of whether or not I move all my stuff or we move one and then one and then one, like, yeah, the simultaneousness of, like, what is in reality happening is not necessarily always what the player's expecting and what they see in their mind, and when things happen that aren't. And in Hobgoblin, like, there's a number of mechanics which are very much speaking to the fact that things are happening simultaneously. So the damage system, for example, in Hobgoblin says, yeah, sure, take your doom tokens. These are a promise to be punished later, but it's not until the end of the turn, exactly as with the most recent Warhammer 40,000 apocalypse. Like, it's not until the end of the turn do you suffer the effects of that, because everyone's getting an axe in the face simultaneously. We just happen to resolve it at separate times, because otherwise it would be chaotic from a gameplay perspective. And so why does charges exist in that case? And if somebody moves into another unit and you can say, well, I was going to charge as well. All right, fine. Well, we both get a charge advantage, but then how does that feel nice on the table then?
Yeah, exactly. So you started Hobgoblin with this sort of, you move around and then you engage, and you're just moving and then you engage and there isn't charging. Now, at this point in Hobgoblin, if you moved a certain distance prior to engaging, on the turn you moved, you get a special charge advantage, and there are a set of rules hung off of the charge advantage. You know,
there are a couple of there are a few rules hung off the charge advantage, but as you were describing that, it makes me think back to the everybody said I have to have a saving throw in Gaslands, so I put a perfunctory saving throw to just quieten all you lot down. Shush, there is a saving throw. Does it ever save anything? No, it doesn't ever save anything, because everything should explode. And in this case, I'm sort of like, although I've built some rules that hang off it, and that's very nice, thank you very much. It's a bit like, is there a charge mechanic in Hobgoblin? Yes, a very perfunctory one that allows you to reroll some ones. And how often does that change the result? Occasionally it makes one damage point swing either way. Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. It's an entirely perfunctory mechanic.
Now, the charge, the mechanic where if you move X many inches, you get a charge bonus, and then there's other things like devastating charge, or things happen if the other person charged or not.
Yeah.
They are all things that you could pluck straight out of the system, and it would make literally no difference to anything. And they are there because people are expecting my heavy cavalry thundered into him, blah, 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 something should happen. However, there's also an element that you can't charge things, that you can't end engaged with something that you couldn't see at the start of your movement. Now, that wasn't true. And that, I don't think, has been inherently put in because people were requesting it. I think that that's something that's come in because the alternative felt very wrong sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's very much a, like, there are rules that I sometimes can't understand when I come back to read them 2 years later, but that, you know, during the playtesting process, something happens on the table and you go, no, I don't know what that was, but it's not happening. How do we figure out mechanically how to stop that happening? And so in Hobgoblin right now, not being able to engage units unless you could see them before you started moving is a fairly elegant solution to the idea that people can't just spin on the spot and go ha ha, or like jump through a wood and go ha ha, or fly over a building and go ha ha. All of which was possible up until that rule, and it might still not be the perfect rule, but it's definitely like that was not necessarily put in perfunctorily because people say you have to have saving throws or you have to be able to see something to charge it. It's more like as the tapestry of the rules emerges, it feels like there's a thread missing.
And I think so. If we're going to crystallize this down to something vaguely useful,
we better.
God forbid.
We've nearly hit time.
Yeah. What I would say is that there's a difference between like expectations, which are, you know, sometimes great to sort of subvert and change around and question. And then there are the things that I would put them in the bucket of being like horrible gotcha moments, you know, is one of the things. But anything that's that horrible. So yeah, with Hobgoblin, there was a point where we were testing, my unit was facing in one direction. It had a building between it and a flying unit facing the complete opposite direction. I went, oh, I'll have this flying unit charge you in the rear. And it's just like, that's not okay. I know that it was always there in the rules, and it was always viable, but anytime that happens to anybody, they're just going to go, stuff this noise. I'm not having this game. This is unacceptable. That is too unpleasant of a gotcha thing to have happen to you. And that, therefore, I think needs to be phased out. That's not somebody going like, oh, expect charges to do this or expect them to do that. That's when you just go, no, nope.
Maybe it's even that one's a tricky one though, because like if you think back to Gaslands, like there's a power that allows you to ignore terrain temporarily. And so like there is potentially some world where, you know, using some combination of things, you could like be behind a building and just like crash through it and smash into somebody that wasn't expecting it. It's probably not quite as egregious as the example that you're giving there. But yeah, like even that does go down to like, well, how many expectations can you subvert?
Yeah, and
before the game just feels wrong.
Yeah, it's about how you subvert them, how you warn your players that the subvert is coming, what prices you put on when somebody pulls off what would be the gotcha thing. And the example in Gaslands is, of course, that skill is only available to the racingiest of racing teams, and that skill costs a bomb in both points and hazard tokens. So if you are using it because you intend to hunt people down through buildings, you are playing a very, very specific game, my friends. You know, and good luck with it, because it is not going to pay you out in the long. No one's going to look at that team and go OP. They're going to go, I mean, I'm happy you enjoyed doing that, but only
hats off, sir.
It's like when I watch, you know, when I see a game that's 100% grinding and I go, well, somebody's enjoying that, I assume. Yeah, so I think it's question.
I mean, but to the point of this video, like, should you have charges in your game, Glenn?
I don't know. I don't know what answer you're expecting. If it's right for your game, if it's right for the thing your game is trying to do, then yes, obviously. And I think the lesson learned, I think maybe from Hobgoblin here is that, you know, question expectations, question standards, but be willing to accept that some of those standards are in there for very good reasons, and that people will vomit all over the tabletop when you break some of them. And don't give people that experience. Don't push them into it because you had some sort of avant-garde game design moment where you insisted on doing something that basically assaults their mental health.
Unless you feel you're right.
Unless you're absolutely certain you're right, and then go ahead and do it. Okay, that's a good place.
Or choose to do it in something that's niche, like spaceship games, where people don't already have a strong expectation. Don't do it in science fiction like squad games where people know exactly what they're supposed to be doing.
Nobody will notice if you do it in a deep space fleet battle game.
No one even knows what this is supposed to feel like.
Okay, that I think is a good place to sign off on this episode of Rule of Carnage. If you've watched through to this point, I assume you like some element of what's going on here, I assume, please hit the like and subscribe button because it makes us happy and feel good. Drop a comment in the comment section, and swing by the Hobgoblin Discord and Facebook group and playtest Hobgoblin and bellow at Mike offensive things for not having proper charges in his game, and drop by the Rule of Carnage Discord channel and further assault Mike with unpleasant and offensive things for not putting proper charges in his games. Look us up on social media, but for now it's going to be thank you and goodbye from this episode of Rule of Carnage. So thank you and goodbye.